I'm C-Dub, and this is a podcast about house music. In the last episode, we talked about how house music entered Europe and how DJs learned to play entire nights through sequencing and patience. That story explained the method. This episode is about what happened when that method met bodies at scale, and you add MDMA and spaces that were never designed to hold what followed. The turning point in the United Kingdom is often dated to the summer of 1988. That summer is now remembered as the second summer of love. The phrase became shorthand, but the changes were concrete. Clubs like Shoom in Southwark and Spectrum at Heaven in London were already introducing Chicago and New York house records to UK audiences. What changed was the intensity and the composition of the crowd. At Shoom, Danny Rampling created a deliberately dark, enclosed environment where the emphasis was on sound, not spectacle. The room was small. The nights were long. The music was house, acid house, and imported records that many people had never heard before. MDMA was present, and its effects were unmistakable. Aggression dropped. Physical closeness increased. People danced for hours without fatigue. The atmosphere shifted from performance to participation. Spectrum at Heaven expanded this model into a larger, more visible venue. Paul Oakenfold's nights brought house and acid house into a club that already had mainstream recognition. The crowd was mixed. Fashion codes loosened. Music that had been marginal began to feel central. The idea that a night could be built gradually, rather than peaking quickly, started to spread. Outside London, similar shifts were happening. At the Hacienda in Manchester, house and acid house records became part of a broader ecosystem that already included post-punk, indie, and experimental dance music. The Eclipse in Coventry opened as one of the first clubs in the UK dedicated almost entirely to house music. These were not underground spaces in the romantic sense. They were commercial venues responding to a real demand. That demand soon exceeded what clubs could even contain. Capacity limits, licensing laws, and closing times created pressure. Promoters began using warehouses, aircraft hangars, and open land. Information about these events circulated through flyers, messages, and word of mouth. Locations were sometimes released only hours before the event. One of the defining features of this phase was the rise of the M25 orbital raves. Events took place in fields and industrial sites around the motorway encircling London. Thousands of people traveled at night, often without knowing exactly where they were going until the last moment. The journey became part of the experience. MDMA played a central role in shaping these gatherings. Its effects altered how people related to one another and to the music. The repetitive structures of house and acid house worked in tandem with the drug's capacity to sustain focus and empathy. Dance floors became spaces where differences of class, race, gender expression, and sexuality were temporarily flattened. This did not erase social reality, but it created moments of shared alignment that were rare elsewhere. These spaces also had an underbelly that was impossible to ignore. Safety was inconsistent. Medical support was uneven. Drug purity was varied at best. Promoters were improvising at scale, often learning through trial and error while the party was happening. At the same time, these environments allowed people who were excluded from mainstream nightlife to occupy space without explanation. Queer dancers, black and brown communities, and working class youth were not guests, they were the culture. By the early 1990s, the scale of these events drew national attention. Media coverage increasingly framed raves as a public order problem. Police intervention escalated. The most widely cited incident was the Castle Morton Common Festival in 1992. Thousands of people gathered over several days in Worcestershire. Sound systems played continuously. The event was unlicensed and uncontrolled. Its visibility forced a political response. Castle Morton did not invent rave culture, but it made it impossible to ignore. In the years that followed, legislation targeted unlicensed gatherings and sound systems. Promoters adapted by moving into licensed venues, organizing festivals, or relocating events. Some sound systems, including collectives like Spiral Tribe, became symbols of resistance and mobility, carrying the culture across Europe. Inside the music itself, changes were underway. DJs needed records that could hold massive crowds together. Bass became more pronounced. Structures became more modular. Tracks were designed to be mixed for long stretches, not just played. Many DJs moved into production because existing records no longer met the demands of the spaces they were playing. House music did not fracture because of these pressures, it multiplied. Clubs continued to host intimate nights focused on control and detail. Raves emphasized endurance and release. Chill-out rooms and after-hours spaces emerged to support recovery and reflection. Café Del Mar in Ibiza, curated by Jose Padilla, who we talked about in the last episode, became a reference point for what happened when intensity gave way to stillness. What tied these environments together was practice rather than genre. DJs still built nights slowly. Grooves still mattered more than spectacle. The focus remained on collective movement rather than individual display. This period also marked a shift in representation that mattered. These spaces were not utopias, but they offered alternatives. They showed that nightlife could center empathy rather than dominance, and they allowed marginalized people to be visible without being targeted. They changed expectations about who dance floors were for. The rave years forced house music to confront its own limits. They revealed where it was fragile and where it was strong. They showed that the culture could expand, absorb pressure, and reorganize without losing its core. I'm C-Dub, and this is a podcast about house music. Until next time, keep the beats alive.